Further tribute, the Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition and the member from Simcoe Grey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm privileged to have known George Raymond McCague. He was a great man, a great mentor, and a great friend, not only to me, but to all those who had the good fortune to be counted among his many friends. As many of you will know, that I worked as George McCaig's assistant for about 7 years during my years at university here and for a few years after that. And I followed the great playwright and author Dan Needles, as the Honourable Member for Barrie has just mentioned. And a couple of weeks before George passed away, he asked me to be an honorary pallbearer, and I thought I better ask him if he wants me to say anything at the funeral. And he said, no, I want somebody to do it right. I've already asked that Needles guy. So George Raymond McCague, here goes. Mr. Speaker, I'm reminded of the proverb, say not in grief, he is no more, but live in thankfulness that he was. I will be eternally grateful to George for the lasting memories he has given me and for the lessons I learned from him. No matter what issues George was involved with over the course of 40 years of public service, he always knew the heart of the matter was addressing problems and people with respect. He knew that respect for all people is at the heart of politics. Although our families have been lifelong friends, I first got to know George when I was a grade 8 student. He was running for re-election in the 1977 provincial campaign and came to my classroom along with the other candidates to speak with us. He stood out from the other two candidates because he treated us like young adults. He didn't deliver talking points or carefully crafted campaign slogans. Of course, that was part of George's charm. He never spoke from a prepared text. My friend Dan Needles, whom George nicknamed McNutt, wrote speeches for him over a 7-year period as his executive assistant here at Queen's Park. George never delivered a single one of those speeches. But he valued Dan's work and would spend hours going back and forth with him and studying those speeches. Then he would put them back in his pocket and speak from the heart. Dan joked when he gave the eulogy for George that the funeral was the first time anything he wrote for George was actually delivered in a poem. Dan was no doubt also wrote the speech George never delivered when he showed up at my grade 8 class. George spoke to us with sincerity and treated us with respect. He showed us he was interested in our thoughts, even though we were too young to vote. Of course, 2 or 3 days later, George showed up at my parents' house, and the next thing I knew, I was volunteering on his campaign. George was always pretty crafty, Mr. Speaker, in his own humble way. He also never forgot the people who helped him and always looked for a chance to help them as well. He gave me my first opportunity to work in a political office when he needed to hire a driver. Actually, George didn't give me any choice. He once again called my mom up and asked what I was doing. She told him, well, he's working while trying to finish his degree at St. Michael's College. George then corrected her and said, no, Teresa, Jim is going to drive for me and work on my correspondence part-time. Later, he encouraged me and supported me in going to work for the Honourable Perrin Beatty in Ottawa. I credit George with setting me on my career path. Some days I also blame him for that. But he always had the best of intentions. George's respect and gratitude for everyone that worked with him inspired loyalty and deep friendship. George always referred to Henry Davis, who couldn't be with us today. Henry was his campaign manager for 5 campaigns. He always referred to him as a peach of a man. And I'm a bit envious of Henry for the glowing praise George always heaped on him when he wasn't in the room. After George swept all the polls in Alliston that were located near the Catholic Church and school in the 1985 election, he went around telling everyone that it was the token Dogan on his staff that made it possible. He was referring, of course, I learned many years later, to me, who was studying Catholic theology at St. Mike's. George's own nickname here at Queen's Park was appropriate to his nature. He was called Quiet George because he never wanted to be, as he put it, a headline hunter. nor did he like to pick fights. He often said that one should never get into a spraying match with a skunk. George's deep faith in democracy, coupled with his humble ego, made him a perfect fit when he served in the roles of Chairman of Management Board of Cabinet and Chair of Cabinet concurrently for many, many years in the Bill Davis government. He enjoyed these jobs immensely. I remember him telling me with a wink that he appreciated that as chairman, he was the person who got to interpret consensus at each meeting. Of course, I was to find out many years later from Premier Davis that he and George had already decided what that consensus was going to be before the meeting had even started. George's wit was dry and often unexpected. After my nomination meeting to run as MPP for Simcoe West, after George retired from Queen's Park, his first words to me when I got off the stage in Creemore were, "Don't screw it up, kid." And I thought that was rather strange. I thought he would congratulate me for being acclaimed, actually. It was a few days later before it dawned on me after a conversation with my father when he reminded me that the riding had been Conservative since Confederation. And he didn't want me to be the first one to lose it. In doing so, George gave me the shove I needed rather than the pat on the back I expected, and I'm grateful for that. Since I was elected, Mr. Speaker, George never once played the armchair quarterback. He was always available for advice anytime I called, but he said I had to do my job the way I thought I should. George Raymond McCague, I will always be grateful for your friendship, mentorship, and leading example of integrity. Your memory will always burn brightly and warmly. We miss you very, very much.